The snow began falling long before either of them realized how serious it would become. At first, it was nothing more than a quiet curtain of white drifting across the windshield, soft enough to feel harmless, almost beautiful. Evelyn Carter sat in the passenger seat with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the road ahead, her jaw tense in that familiar way everyone at the company knew too well. Control was her comfort, and uncertainty had never been welcome in her world. Darius Brooks, a black single father, drove in silence beside her, his dark brown hands steady on the wheel, his focus unbroken despite the worsening conditions. He had lived long enough with unpredictability to recognize danger before it announced itself. By the time the snow thickened into a blinding storm and the road disappeared beneath layers of ice, it was already too late to turn back. The GPS lost signal. Cell phones flickered between one bar and none. The mountains closed around them like a trap. Evelyn felt it then, a subtle crack in her composure, the unsettling realization that no amount of authority or preparation could command the weather. When the car finally skidded to a stop near a nearly invisible roadside lodge, the silence between them grew heavier than the storm outside. They were not just stranded. They were forced into proximity neither had ever wanted. She was the strict, untouchable CEO who demanded perfection. He was the quiet, black single father who never asked for anything beyond survival. That night, as the wind howled and the temperature dropped to dangerous levels, the choices they made would strip away titles, defenses, and carefully built walls. What began as a desperate attempt to survive the cold would slowly become something far more complicated, far more intimate, and impossible to forget. The lodge appeared almost by accident, a dim silhouette buried beneath layers of white, its flickering porch light barely visible through the blinding snowfall. Darius slowed the car instinctively, tires crunching against ice as he guided the vehicle into the narrow clearing. The engine coughed once before settling into a low, uneasy hum, as if even the machine understood how fragile their situation had become. Evelyn Carter did not speak immediately. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, fingers clenched around her phone, as if sheer willpower might force a signal to appear. Nothing happened. The screen remained dark and unresponsive, a silent confirmation that the world she controlled so effortlessly had slipped beyond her reach. Outside, the wind screamed across the mountains, shaking the trees and erasing the road they had come from. Darius shut off the engine and turned toward her, his voice calm but firm as he explained that continuing to drive would be dangerous. She exhaled sharply, frustration flickering across her face before discipline forced it back into place. Evelyn was not accustomed to being told what could not be done. As the CEO of Carter Group, she was used to solutions, contingencies, and compliance. Yet the storm did not care who she was. Inside the lodge, warmth was scarce. But shelter was undeniable. The caretaker, an elderly man with weary eyes, informed them apologetically that only one room remained available. One room. The words landed between them with immediate tension. Evelyn rejected the idea outright, her tone clipped, insisting that arrangements be made elsewhere, anywhere. Darius remained silent, observing the trembling windows, the growing roar of the wind, the caretaker's helpless shrug. When the man mentioned that the highway had been officially closed and rescue would not come until morning at the earliest, Evelyn's protest faltered. Reality pressed in slowly, painfully, leaving her with no leverage left to wield. The room they were led to was small, utilitarian, its wooden walls worn smooth by time and neglect. A single narrow bed sat against the far wall, accompanied by a nightstand and a heater that rattled uncertainly, struggling to push out lukewarm air. Evelyn stood near the door, coat still on, arms folded tightly across her chest as if distance alone could protect her. Darius offered quietly to sleep on the floor. He had done worse during construction jobs and emergency shifts. But the caretaker shook his head gravely, warning that the cold would worsen after nightfall and that the heater might fail entirely. Evelyn said nothing, her gaze fixed on the bed as if it were an accusation. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. The heater fell silent. The temperature dropped almost instantly, creeping into their bones with ruthless efficiency. Evelyn shivered despite herself, irritation giving way to something more unsettling. Fear. Darius recognized the signs immediately. Years of experience had taught him how quickly cold could become lethal, especially after long shifts where he'd watched black men like him push their bodies too far. He spoke carefully, suggesting they share the bed to conserve warmth, emphasizing practicality over comfort. Evelyn bristled at the idea, every instinct screaming against it, her mind racing through boundaries, professionalism, and the unspoken rules she lived by. Yet her body betrayed her resolve, trembling uncontrollably as the cold tightened its grip. She hesitated for a long moment before nodding once sharply, as if agreement were a concession she despised. They set rules spoken aloud in clipped tones, rules that sounded more like armor than reassurance. When they finally lay down, fully clothed, separated by a narrow space that felt far too intimate, silence filled the room. The storm battered the lodge relentlessly, each gust a reminder of how exposed they truly were. Evelyn stared at the ceiling, acutely aware of Darius's presence beside her, of the warmth radiating from his deep brown skin, even through the layers of fabric between them. Despite the chill, she told herself this was temporary, necessary, meaningless. Darius lay awake as well, staring into the darkness, conscious of how tense she was, how carefully she held herself, as though proximity alone threatened to undo her. He adjusted the blanket slightly, ensuring it covered her shoulders more securely, a small act born of habit rather than intention. She noticed, her breath catching for just a moment before she forced herself to relax again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, relentless and unforgiving, sealing them into a night neither of them had anticipated. The night stretched endlessly, as if time itself had slowed under the weight of the storm. The wind howled against the lodge, slipping through every crack and seam, carrying with it a cold that felt alive, searching, relentless. Evelyn lay rigid on the narrow mattress, every muscle tense, her mind refusing rest, even as exhaustion crept in. She was acutely aware of Darius's breathing beside her, slow and steady, a quiet rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. She hated how comforting that sound was. It unsettled her more than the storm, more than the darkness, because it reminded her of how long it had been since she had allowed herself to feel safe in the presence of another person. The cold continued to seep deeper, and despite her determination, her shivering returned, sharper this time, uncontrollable. Darius noticed immediately. He shifted closer, hesitating only a second before gently placing his arm along her back, not pulling her in, just offering warmth. Evelyn inhaled sharply, instinctively stiffening, but the heat from his body cut through the cold in a way the thin blanket never could. She didn't push him away. That small surrender felt louder than any argument they had ever had in a boardroom. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the storm and the creak of the old building, straining to withstand it. Eventually words slipped out, hesitant and quiet, almost as if spoken to the darkness rather than to each other. Darius spoke first, his voice low, telling her about nights he had spent awake beside his son's bed, listening to the same kind of silence after a fever finally broke, after fear loosened its grip. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. He simply stated facts, moments of responsibility that had shaped him without asking permission. In his mind, he could see Lucas's warm brown skin and tight curls damp with sweat, a small black boy sleeping through storms he never knew his father held back for him. Evelyn listened, surprised by how easily his words painted images in her mind. She imagined a small boy sleeping peacefully, unaware of the weight his father carried for him every single day. Something in her chest tightened, an emotion she struggled to name. When she spoke, it came out softer than she expected, her voice stripped of authority, confessing how she had spent years building walls so high she could no longer see past them. She spoke of late nights alone in glass offices, of success that felt hollow once the applause faded, of the constant pressure to be unbreakable. Darius didn't interrupt, he didn't offer solutions or reassurances, he simply listened, his presence steady, grounding. The storm reached its peak sometime after midnight, the temperature plunging further as the wind screamed like a living thing. Evelyn's shivering worsened, her body betraying her again as fatigue and cold joined forces. Darius felt it immediately, his concern sharpening into urgency. He pulled her closer this time, more decisively, murmuring to her to stay awake, to keep talking. She tried to respond, but her words slurred slightly, fear flashing through her eyes. For the first time that night, fear overtook pride entirely. She clutched at his jacket, fingers cold and unsteady, anchoring herself to him as if instinct knew what her mind resisted. Darius adjusted their position, wrapping the blanket tighter around them, pressing warmth into her back, her hands, her shoulders. He spoke continuously about anything, everything, keeping her focused, alert, present. Slowly, agonizingly, her shivering eased, her breathing steadied, though exhaustion claimed her soon after. Darius stayed awake long after her eyes closed, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest, listening to the storm begin to lose its fury. In the dim light before dawn, the world outside fell eerily quiet, snow blanketing everything in a deceptive calm. When Evelyn finally stirred, the sky beyond the window pale and still, she realized she was warm, truly warm. Her head rested against Darius's chest, his arms still secure around her. For a moment she didn't move, didn't think. She simply existed in the fragile peace of survival. When she finally pulled back carefully, their eyes met, something unspoken passing between them. Gratitude, vulnerability, a shift neither could undo. The storm had trapped them together, but it had also stripped them bare, leaving behind something raw and undeniably real. Morning arrived without ceremony, a thin gray light seeping through the frost-laced window as if hesitant to disturb what the storm had altered during the night. The silence outside was profound, the kind that followed devastation rather than peace, and it pressed gently against the walls of the lodge. Darius was the first to fully wake, his body stiff from hours spent, half curled, half alert, never allowing himself to sink completely into sleep. He became aware of the weight against his chest, the steady warmth of Evelyn still resting there, her breathing slow and even. For a brief moment he remained still, afraid that any movement would shatter something fragile and undefined. The night had stripped them of titles and defenses, but daylight had a way of restoring reality with brutal efficiency. Evelyn stirred soon after, her brow creasing as awareness returned in pieces. The first thing she noticed was warmth, unfamiliar and grounding, followed by the subtle ache in her muscles and the dull memory of fear. Then she realized where she was, who she was with, and the way his arm was still around her. Her instinct was to pull away immediately to reclaim space and composure, but something held her there for an extra heartbeat. Gratitude lingered, heavy and undeniable. When she finally shifted back, their eyes met, and neither of them spoke. Words felt inadequate, almost intrusive after everything that had passed between them in the dark. Evelyn sat up slowly, brushing hair from her face, suddenly acutely aware of how exposed she felt without her usual armor of professionalism and control. Darius followed her movement, sitting on the edge of the bed, stretching stiff fingers and glancing toward the window as if anchoring himself to something neutral. Outside, the world was buried beneath snow, trees bent low, roads invisible, as though the storm had erased every path leading away from that moment. They prepared in silence, gathering their things, avoiding unnecessary contact, while remaining keenly aware of each other's presence. The caretaker knocked softly, an hour later, informing them that rescue crews were working to clear the roads, but it would take time. Evelyn nodded, thanking him with a sincerity that surprised even herself. Waiting became inevitable. With nothing to do but endure, conversation returned slowly, cautiously, different now in tone. It was no longer about survival, but reflection. Evelyn found herself asking about Lucas again, wanting to know what kind of child he was, what made him laugh. Darius spoke more easily this time, describing a boy who loved dinosaurs and hated winter coats, whose world revolved around simple joys Evelyn had long forgotten. He mentioned the way Lucas's tight curls bounced when he ran, the way his warm brown face lit up when he saw snow outside the window for the first time. She listened genuinely, imagining a life so unlike her own, yet grounded in something she realized she lacked. When she spoke of her career, it was without pride or defensiveness, only honesty. She admitted how lonely the summit felt, how exhausting it was to always be the strongest person in the room. Darius didn't respond with admiration or pity. He simply acknowledged it, recognizing the weight she carried without diminishing his own. As a black man who had learned to move carefully through boardrooms and job sites alike, he understood more than he said. Hours passed before the sound of engines cut through the quiet rescue vehicles carving paths through the snow. As they stepped outside, cold air biting at their skin, Evelyn paused, taking one last look at the lodge that had forced her into vulnerability. The ride back to civilization was subdued, neither of them quite ready to return to who they had been before. Back in the city, routine rushed to meet them, emails flooding inboxes, meetings rescheduled, crises re-emerging as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet for Evelyn, everything felt altered. She noticed Darius differently now, not just as a reliable employee, but as a man whose strength came from resilience rather than authority. In meetings, she found herself listening more, softening where she once would have pushed harder. Darius noticed, too, the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the way she no longer spoke solely from a place of command. Their interactions remained professional, but an undercurrent of understanding flowed beneath every exchange. Weeks passed, the memory of the storm settling into something quieter yet persistent. One evening, after a long day, Evelyn found herself lingering in her office, watching the city lights flicker on below. When Darius knocked, hesitant but purposeful, she felt a flicker of anticipation she didn't try to suppress. He spoke of Lucas, of how he wanted to show him that life could still move forward after loss. That connection wasn't something to fear. Evelyn listened, heart pounding, recognizing her own reflection in his words. When she agreed to dinner, it wasn't with the certainty she applied to business decisions, but with something far more terrifying and alive: hope. Their relationship did not erupt into passion or dramatic declarations. It unfolded slowly, shaped by caution, mutual respect, and the shared memory of a night when survival demanded honesty. The storm had forced them together, but it was the aftermath that defined them, teaching them that strength did not always mean standing alone, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections were forged, not in comfort, but in the coldest, darkest moments. Time did not rush them forward, and in some quiet way, both Evelyn and Darius were grateful for that. After the storm, after the return to glass towers and polished conference rooms, they moved through their days with a heightened awareness of each other that neither openly acknowledged. It was not awkwardness exactly, but a careful restraint, like two people carrying something fragile through a crowded place, mindful not to drop it before they understood what it was. Evelyn threw herself back into work with renewed intensity, yet the sharp edges of her leadership began to soften in ways even she did not fully understand. She still demanded excellence, still expected accountability, but she listened longer, interrupted less, and allowed silence to exist without filling it with authority. Darius noticed the change before anyone else. In meetings, her eyes would sometimes linger on him for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, not with scrutiny, but with something closer to curiosity. He responded by remaining exactly who he had always been: steady, prepared, quietly competent. Yet inside, something restless stirred. The storm had unsettled him too, awakening parts of himself he had carefully tucked away since his wife's death. He had learned to survive by narrowing his world to his son and his responsibilities, believing that was all he could afford. Now, cracks had appeared in that certainty. One late afternoon, as snow began falling again outside the office windows, lighter this time, almost gentle, Evelyn called Darius into her office. The request was phrased professionally, but he sensed hesitation beneath it. When he arrived, she was standing by the window, city lights reflecting in the glass, her posture rigid as if bracing herself. She spoke about a new project, another site visit scheduled in the coming weeks, then paused, the words trailing off. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt heavier than any storm. Finally, she asked him quietly how Lucas was adjusting to winter. The question was simple, personal, and entirely unnecessary for business. Darius answered honestly, surprised by how easily the words came. He spoke of school mornings, of mittens constantly misplaced, of laughter echoing through small moments that made the cold bearable. Evelyn listened, arms folded loosely now, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she thanked him, not for the information, but for sharing it. The distinction mattered more than either of them said. Over the following days, small moments accumulated. A shared elevator ride where conversation drifted beyond work. A late meeting that ended with coffee rather than instructions. None of it crossed a line, yet the space between them grew charged with unspoken possibility. Darius struggled with it at night, lying awake after Lucas fell asleep, clutching his favorite worn-out dinosaur, replaying glances and half-finished sentences, reminding himself of the risks. Evelyn wrestled with her own doubts, questioning whether she was drawn to the man or to the version of herself she had been forced to confront in the mountains. She had spent her life believing vulnerability was a weakness, something to be managed or eliminated. Now it followed her, quiet but persistent, asking to be acknowledged. The tension reached a subtle breaking point during another stormy evening months later when a power outage swept through part of the city. Evelyn found herself alone in her office, darkness pressing in as memories of the mountain night resurfaced unbidden. Without fully thinking it through, she called Darius. He answered immediately, concern evident in his voice. He offered to come by to make sure she was all right. She hesitated, pride warring with something deeper, then agreed. When he arrived, the city was dim, the building eerily quiet. They sat together in her office, illuminated by the faint glow of emergency lights, sharing the silence without fear this time. The conversation flowed more freely than ever before, touching on regrets, hopes, and the strange ways life rerouted plans without warning. At one point, Evelyn laughed softly, surprised by the sound of it, and Darius realized how rarely he had seen her truly relaxed. The moment felt suspended, balanced on the edge of something neither dared name. When the lights finally returned, reality rushed back in, but neither moved to leave. They stood close, aware of the space between them, of how easily it could disappear. Evelyn broke the moment by stepping back, thanking him again, her voice steady but her eyes uncertain. Darius nodded, understanding the hesitation even as it disappointed him. As he left, neither knew whether they had taken a step forward or merely circled the truth. What they did know was that whatever had begun in the snowstorm was not finished. It lingered between them, unresolved, waiting for the moment when fear would no longer outweigh the quiet pull drawing them closer. The days that followed that night in the darkened office passed with an almost unbearable slowness, as if time itself were testing their resolve. Evelyn returned to her routines with precision. Yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. She found herself arriving earlier than necessary, lingering later than usual, filling her calendar, not because it demanded it, but because stillness had become dangerous. In quiet moments, memories surfaced uninvited. The sound of the wind tearing through the lodge, the warmth of Darius's arm around her when fear had stripped her of certainty, the calm in his voice when everything else had felt out of control. She told herself those memories were a product of circumstance, of stress, and survival. But repetition had a way of weakening denial. Darius, meanwhile, struggled with a different kind of unrest. At home, after Lucas had fallen asleep clutching his favorite worn-out dinosaur, Darius would sit at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, replaying conversations that hadn't quite happened. He had lived for years in a state of emotional restraint, believing it was the only way to keep his son safe from further loss. Yet now, restraint felt less like protection and more like avoidance. The connection he felt with Evelyn unsettled him precisely because it asked nothing dramatic of him, only honesty. At work, they continued their careful dance. Meetings were efficient, professional, yet charged with undercurrents neither addressed. Sometimes Evelyn would ask his opinion on matters she could easily decide alone, watching closely as he spoke, as if weighing not just his words, but the steadiness behind them. Darius answered as he always had, measured and thoughtful, though he sensed that she was listening in a new way, not as a superior evaluating performance, but as a woman trying to understand another human being. Their colleagues noticed subtle changes, but could not name them. Evelyn seemed less severe, more present. Darius appeared more confident, his quiet authority gaining recognition without his asking for it. The shift was gradual, organic, and impossible to attribute to any single cause. One afternoon, Evelyn surprised herself by leaving the office early. Snow had begun to fall again, light and unthreatening, dusting the sidewalks with white. She walked without destination, letting the cold air bite her cheeks, grounding her in the present. For the first time in years, she felt an unfamiliar longing, not for success, not for control, but for connection uncomplicated by expectation. She thought of Darius's stories about Lucas, about bedtime rituals and shared breakfasts, about a life built on presence rather than ambition. The contrast to her own existence was stark. That evening, she made a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. She invited Darius to dinner, not framed as a meeting or obligation, but as a simple request. When he read the message, his heart pounded harder than it had during any storm. He hesitated, considering the implications, the risks, the unspoken boundaries. Then he thought of the night she had trusted him with her life, and he replied, yes. Dinner was quiet, awkward at first, conversations circling safely around familiar topics. Yet beneath the surface, tension coiled tightly. As the evening progressed, words flowed more freely, laughter slipping in where formality once reigned. They spoke about books, music, the small choices that shaped their paths long before they crossed. When Darius mentioned his late wife, the room fell silent, grief hovering between them. Evelyn did not rush to fill the space. She listened, her empathy unguarded, understanding that some pain did not require fixing, only witnessing. That understanding deepened something between them, fragile yet undeniable. When the night ended, they stood outside the restaurant, snow settling gently around them. For a moment, neither moved. The impulse to reach out pulsed between them, electric and restrained. Evelyn broke the silence by thanking him, her voice sincere. Darius nodded, his expression open yet cautious. They parted without touching, the absence more powerful than any gesture could have been. In the weeks that followed, their connection continued to evolve, shaped by restraint as much as desire. They shared more time, yet carefully respecting the complexities of their lives. Darius introduced Evelyn to Lucas gradually, cautiously, allowing trust to form naturally. Evelyn approached this boy with patience, aware of the responsibility such a connection carried. She found herself softened by Lucas's curiosity, his unfiltered honesty, his easy laughter. Through him, she glimpsed a version of life she had long dismissed as incompatible with her own, a black family's warmth built from everyday moments instead of grand victories. Still, doubts lingered. Evelyn questioned whether she could ever fully step out of the role she had built, whether vulnerability would cost her the authority she had fought so hard to claim. Darius worried about the balance between protecting his son and allowing himself happiness. Neither voiced these fears aloud, yet they shaped every decision, every pause. One evening, months later, another storm rolled in. Not the violent, life-threatening force they had once faced, but a steady snowfall that transformed the city into a muted landscape of white. Darius and Evelyn found themselves together again, watching flakes drift past the window, the memory of the mountains hanging unspoken in the air. The storm no longer frightened them, but it reminded them of how easily circumstances could change, how fragile certainty truly was. They sat side by side, close but not touching, the space between them filled with possibility and hesitation. Evelyn finally spoke, admitting that she didn't know where this path led, only that turning away felt impossible. Darius listened, his expression thoughtful, aware that the choice before them was not about passion or fear, but about courage. The storm outside intensified slightly, wind whispering against the glass, echoing the night that had first bound them together. Inside, the question remained unanswered, suspended between them, waiting for the moment when one of them would be brave enough to step forward and see what lay beyond restraint. The storm outside faded gradually, not with the violence of the night that had once trapped them in the mountains, but with a quiet persistence that mirrored the choice now resting between them. Snow continued to fall in soft layers, reshaping the city into something slower, gentler, as if time itself had agreed to pause. Evelyn sat still, her hands wrapped around a mug she had long forgotten to drink from, her gaze fixed on the window. For most of her life, decisions had been immediate, decisive, irreversible. She was trained to act, to lead, to move forward without hesitation. Yet this choice asked for something entirely different. It asked her to feel. Darius watched her from across the room, recognizing the conflict written across her face. He had seen that same expression once before in the dim light of the lodge when survival had demanded she let go of control. He understood then, as he did now, that pressure alone could never guide her to the answer. What she needed was safety, not certainty. He spoke quietly, breaking the silence with care, telling her that whatever she chose, it would be enough. That there was no timeline, no expectation, no demand placed upon her beyond honesty. His words settled between them, steady and grounding. Evelyn exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing as if she had been holding her breath for years. She turned to him then, truly turned, meeting his eyes without armor, without strategy. She admitted that she was afraid, not of him, not of love, but of losing herself, afraid that softness would be mistaken for weakness, that letting someone in would dismantle the structure she had built to survive. Darius listened, absorbing every word, then answered with the quiet confidence that defined him. He told her that strength had never been about standing alone, that the strongest thing he had ever done was choose to love his son again after loss, knowing the risk of pain. As a black man raising a black boy in a world that didn't always see them clearly, he had learned that love itself was an act of courage. He didn't promise her perfection or ease, he promised presence. The honesty of that promise struck deeper than any grand declaration could have. For a long moment they sat in silence, the snowfall outside thickening, the city muffled beneath it. Then Evelyn made a choice, not with dramatic certainty, but with deliberate courage. She reached for Darius's hand, her touch tentative yet resolute. It was a small gesture, almost understated, but it carried the weight of every fear she had faced and every wall she had dismantled. Darius's fingers closed around hers, steady and warm, grounding her in the present. In that moment, nothing needed to be said. The weeks that followed were not marked by sweeping changes, but by intentional ones. Evelyn did not abandon her career, nor did Darius reshape his life overnight. Instead, they built something real within the spaces they already occupied. Evelyn learned to delegate not out of efficiency, but trust. She learned that leadership could coexist with empathy, that authority did not vanish when vulnerability entered the room. Darius allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than survival. Opening his world gradually, carefully, Lucas became the quiet center of that future. His acceptance of Evelyn was cautious but sincere. She approached him not as someone seeking approval, but as someone willing to earn trust step by step. Seasons changed. Snow gave way to early spring, and with it came a sense of renewal neither of them rushed to define. They faced challenges, whispers at work, doubts from within, moments when fear threatened to reclaim its hold. But they met them together, not as a perfect pair, but as two people committed to growth. The memory of the snowstorm never faded, but it transformed from a moment of crisis into a reminder of how fragile control could be and how powerful connection was when chosen freely. One evening, months later, they returned to the mountains, not out of necessity, but intention. The lodge stood quiet beneath a clear sky, snow long melted, the road open and welcoming. Standing there, Evelyn realized how far she had come. Not because she had changed who she was, but because she had allowed herself to expand. Darius squeezed her hand gently, dark brown fingers wrapping around hers, and she smiled, not with triumph, but with peace. They did not promise forever in that moment. They didn't need to. What they had was something sturdier than certainty, mutual respect, shared resilience, and the courage to face whatever storms came next side by side. As they drove back down the mountain, the road stretching clear before them, Evelyn rested her head against the window, watching the landscape unfold. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't focused on the destination. She was present, fully content in the knowledge that sometimes being trapped by a storm was not an ending, but the beginning of everything that mattered.